sorry it has to end this way, brother.
No, you're not.
Dad's going to kill you.
You're sick. You're hurting my feelings. You will never rise from the ashes of your shame and humiliation. I am about to celebrate becoming an only child.
You think I'm a monster? No, I love you, Azula.
It was not by chance that Azula had been defeated. It was always clear that Azula was the greater combatant, the greater strategist, and the greater power. Azula had always been feared, and with that fear, she held the dreaded power to control anyone. But she'd met her match in the face of compassion. Her friends and family, Zuko, Mai, Ty Lee, and Ursa, had refused to fight Azula, leaving her open to her own insecurities. Dangerous, yet defenseless, Azula was left to decide her own fate. What was it Zuko said, she thinks? It's my turn now. Azula takes a moment to collect herself. She stands up, avoids Ursa's glare, and stares directly into Zuko's eyes. You managed to get quite the better of me years back, Zuzu. I did not deserve to be Fire Lord if I was too weak to defeat you. However, recently I have regained my composure and have defeated you, the reigning Fire Lord in glorious Agni Kai. I know that I am not meant to be Fire Lord, but then again, the current Fire Lord remains too soft and too fragile. It's time we set the record straight once and for all. Zuko stares back at Azula dumbfounded. Before he can say anything, Ursa, Mai, and Ty Lee anxiously interject, pleading with Zuko to deny the request. You're in no position to fight, says Ursa. Zuko looks at his mother, Mai, and Ty Lee for a second, and then turns his attention back to his sister. 2 weeks, he says solemnly. Zuko assigns royal guards to accompany Azula wherever she goes in the palace. She is not allowed to leave or to bend unless she is practicing under careful watch of Mai and Ty Lee. Azula graciously accepted Zuko's terms and takes this time to convalesce over the events of the prior days. Although she willingly agreed to Zuko's terms, she still finds the whole situation perplexing. How did he do this to me, she thinks. All of the others too. How could they defeat me without a single strike? Azula, my love, are you alright? Calls Ursa from the next room. Ursa had been trying for days to talk with Azula, going as far as to move to the adjacent room where she knew Azula would be able to hear her, to feel her presence. Surprisingly, Azula had made some effort to talk with Zuko, and even Mai, but Ursa she would avoid. Ursa she shunned out of fear of her conflicted feelings. Azula, please my child, know that I will always be here for you. Frustrated and on the brink of a breakdown, Azula requests an audience with Zuko. Take me to see father. I think I have some words for him alone. Is it mom? Asked Zuko. I told her she should give you some space, but she clearly didn't listen. That's enough about her, Zuzu. Take me to father now. Zuko nods, dismisses the half-dozen guards stationed between Azula and himself, and leads her down the path to the royal prison. On the way, Azula asks Zuko, so, when I've defeated you in Agni Kai, are you going to stick me in a place like this too? Or perhaps you'll take mercy on me and put me back in the crazy house. Zuko stops walking, holds his fire torch closer to Azula's face, and replies, I've gotten plenty of requests to do exactly that, or worse. All suggestions have been personally ignored. Zuko continues walking down the corridor, leaving Azula stupefied. Clearly, he has lost his mind, that Zuzu. Right? Thinks Azula. Hurry up, calls Zuko, his voice echoing back dozens of yards. Azula hurries to his position, joining him directly outside of Ozai's cell. Zuko looks over at Azula with a raised eyebrow. Go ahead in, he says. Won't you join me? Asks Azula, slyly. I've said my piece to him in the past. Besides, he doesn't have much to say to the Fire Lord these days. Zuko gives a slight grin and walks back down the hall. Azula watches as he disappears around a dark corner, then turns her attention back to the door. Azula's feelings on Ozai are much less conflicted than that of her mother. He is nothing to her now, just a shell of his former self. However, there is one thing she desperately needs to know. One thing she knows he thoroughly understands. Azula opens the door slowly and takes a couple steps forward. "Azula," says Ozai in an aged, gravelly voice. Azula stares down at what remains of her father. His hair is all but snow white. His skin hangs loose, and there's no mistaking the tiredness in his voice. "How did you know it was I, father?" Your brother cares not for subtlety when he opens that door, nor do the guards. Of course, I've had no regal visits in quite some time. What brings you here? Has he imprisoned you as well? No. Yes. Maybe, I don't know, stammers Azula. For what I've done, I ought to be thrown down here for the rats, just as you have. But that's just it. He hasn't done it. Why is that? Ozai stares at Azula a moment, notices a tear staining her left cheek, her collar bent out of shape, the slight tremble in her limbs. Instantly, a smirk spreads across his lips. "You are weak," he says. "He doesn't imprison you because he no longer fears you." Azula wipes a tear away and replies, "You're right. His fear has been replaced by something foolish. Sympathy? Compassion? Madness? But what of the others?" asks Azula. "My former friends don't fear me either. It's driving me crazy," she screams. "Azula, silence yourself," snaps Ozai. "Look at me. Despite your foolish weakness in the past, your brother has always been beneath you, beneath your cunning and your skill. He does not fear you, nor do the others, because they do not believe you to be the same Azula that I do. One born to be Fire Lord and succeed me, the Phoenix King." Ozai begins to cackle loudly, filling the cell with mad laughter. Azula stares back at her father, notices the bloodshot in his eyes, the familiar white coat wrapped around his torso, the musty reek of his cell. At once, she realizes the deception, how he has tried to manipulate her. Clearly, he has gone mad in this cell, lost all grip on reality, and descended into insanity. Azula gives a traditional bow and replies, "All hail the Phoenix King." Ozai continues to cackle, louder and louder than before, until he's retching on the floor. Azula slips out of the room slowly, making sure the iron door is shut tightly behind her. She bumps into Zuko halfway down the hall. "What happened?" Azula nervously replies, "I got what I wanted." Zuko stares at Azula perplexed. He's rarely seen her so bothered by anything. "Come on," says Zuko. "We have a play to catch." Zuko drops Azula off at her quarters with a single ticket. She takes it, examines it, but says nothing. Zuko only nods and leaves her alone. On the other side of the door, Ursa begins to call to Azula, but Zuko stops her and takes her on a walk throughout the palace. Azula lays slumped over her bed, staring blankly at the ticket. She hadn't noticed before, but the ticket reads, "Admittance 1, Love Amongst the Dragons." At first, Azula is angry, belligerently burning the ticket into ash. The play reminds her of her mother, whom she hates. Azula doesn't stop with the ticket though, as she begins to burn every painting of her mother or Ozai that she sees. By the end, her room is covered in gray dust and black ash. Guards storm into her room, hands and spears at the ready for an attack, but Zuko arrives shortly thereafter, dismissing them all. He walks up to Azula, coughing through the dust. She zaps the floor beneath him with lightning, sending him back a couple feet. Zuko rebounds, but doesn't firebend, only reaching a hand out to Azula. Come on your feet. And no surprises this time. I'm still sore from last week. Suits you right, says Azula, ignoring his gesture and regaining her feet. Keep that wretched woman away from me, and I'll join you at the play. Noted, says Zuko solemnly, and they both leave together. On the way to the theater, Azula notices that Zuko is uncharacteristically calm. So, no big lectures about the evils of arson? Nah, says Zuko. Aren't you gonna say anything, Azula snaps? About father? About me? Maybe, says Zuko. Maybe it's time to accept that your little mind games don't work. At least not when I'm not afraid. Azula digs her nails into Zuko's back and shoves them as hard as she can. Zuko's arms crash into the earth, covering him in scrapes and bruises. Azula looks down at him in glee, expecting to see anger reflected back through Zuko's eyes, or maybe even a hint of fear. However, Zuko only stands, dusts himself off, and sighs. You should save that for our rematch. Azula slumps forward a bit, a clear look of defeat spread across her face. I'm more than a match for a weakling like you, Zuzu, she screams, nostrils flared in anger. And I won't be accompanying you to another ridiculous play. Suit yourself, says Zuko, calmly walking off. Azula considers leaving the capital. Surely she can defeat all the guards and escape unscathed. Seconds before she's made her choice, she hears her mother's voice once again, calling out to her. She struggles to identify if she's imagined her mother's voice or if she is really closing in on her. Without looking for confirmation, she bolts down the path Zuko took to the Royal Theater. On the way, she looks around and notices that the entire capital is still deserted from their last skirmish. Every street corner, every building is devoid of life. She knows she's near Zuko in the theater when she hears sounds besides the tapping of her own boots. Once inside, Azula is transported back to her childhood as nostalgic memories of the Ember Island players flood her mind. At the top, in the nosebleed seats, sits Zuko. Azula is surprised to see a relatively full front row consisting of important advisors, royal guards, and a few notable business leaders. Azula makes her way up to Zuko amidst some strong glares from the rest of the theater, including some of the actors. Yes, that's right, thinks Azula. Scared? You should be. She joins Zuko at the top, and he gives her a knowing look. It was Mom, wasn't it? You just know me so well, she says sarcastically. So, are you going to bore me with a non-butchered version of Love Amongst the Dragons? Zuko nods no, and asks, haven't you given the cast a good look yet? Azula looks down at the play, examines the actors. The actor playing the Blue Spirit brazenly fumbles every other line. In the background, you can hear the director feeding him lines. Oh, says Azula shocked. You got the Ember Island players. Not just that, says Zuko. These are the same exact actors and director from all of those summers ago when we were kids. Azula can't help but to feel a pang of happiness. Despite the bad performance, Azula allows herself, if only for a few hours, to truly relax and enjoy her time with her brother. She falls asleep halfway through, and when she awakes, Zuko is helping her to her feet. How was the play? Says Azula with a yawn. The worst I've ever seen, says Zuko with a smile. The smile Azula had graciously adopted mere moments before transformed itself into a confused grimace. Zuko, chipper as ever, looked down at Azula in the dim moonlight. We've got to get Mother in on this. She would die of embarrassment. Azula continued to look down at the street. Not a word pursed her lips, and Zuko was beginning to worry. Azula, "Are you alright?" asked Zuko uneasily. Azula refused to answer. Her grimace hung lower and lower on her face. Her instincts were going haywire. She had enjoyed herself very much at the theater, seeing her father, the Fire Lord, for the weak and fragile man that he really was. She had allowed herself to be truly comfortable for the first time in many years. Too comfortable. A split second before Zuko could react, Azula unleashed a massive volley of lightning from her frantic fingertips. At the last second, Azula redirected the blast up into the sky, sparing Zuko. The blast illuminated the sky in a brilliant blue glow. While everyone was distracted, Azula bolted down the path out of the capital. Dozens of royal guards began to pursue her, but Zuko called for a ceasefire. However, some guards among his rank had begun to question his authority. It would seem that not all anti-Zuko sentiment had been stamped out, and Zuko's recent orders had seemed more and more unreasonable. As Azula was pursued up the mountain, Zuko found himself deadlocked in a fight against traitors. While dodging the flames of a half-dozen guards, Zuko lamented Azula's betrayal. This distraction provided one of the traitors a potentially fatal opening, but he was thwarted by the arrival of Mai and Ty Lee. The combined might of Mai, Ty Lee, and a disoriented Zuko and a few other loyal guards proved enough to defeat the traitors, though some managed to escape. Zuko took a second to take in his surroundings and was horrified by what he saw. The theater he and Azula had so thoroughly enjoyed that evening was badly scorched near the entrance. Badly burned actors screamed in agony upon the ground. A single tear stained Zuko's scarred cheek. At his feet, a burning man reached up, his arms outstretched for aid. Mai took over command of the guards as Zuko extinguished the man and the theater. Once all the fires were dealt with, Zuko collapsed to the ground in exhaustion and shame. Mai attempted to comfort him, gently caressing his shoulder and asserting that everything would be okay. Zuko allowed Mai's warmth to overtake him as they assembled all the best physicians in the capital city. Meanwhile, up on the mountain crater, Azula continued to evade royal guards. However, Azula refused to fight back. She couldn't shake the guilt that had built up inside of her. She had truly felt happy for a couple fleeting moments, yet she'd thrown it all away out of confusion and instinct. Down the cliffside, Azula spotted a small alcove of rock, and feigning a direct attack, Azula managed to distract the guards long enough to slip within its recesses. This should buy me some time, thought Azula. The lead guard, a grizzled, hard-spoken man known as Commander Yamada, became frustrated. "How could you allow her to escape?" "We had no choice, Commander," says a tall and slender guard named Officer Shu. She acted as if she were preparing to strike. "Our Fire Lord will be most displeased by our failure. I'll likely be removed from command. My father, his father, and my great uncle before him have sworn to the Fire Lord to do their duty under penalty of death. I honor their memory and their will. No captures this time, men. If you should spot her, show her no mercy." "But sir," counters Officer Shu. "But nothing, Officer Shu. I am in charge here." Just then, the faint screech of a messenger hawk rang throughout the mountain. "Great," mutters Commander Yamada in a bitter tone. The messenger hawk swooped down and landed gently upon Commander Yamada's wrist. Attached to his back was an embroidered message, clearly from the Fire Lord. Commander Yamada opened the message, but did not read aloud. A few moments later, the cliffside was consumed by a bright flash of light as the commander burnt the message to ash. "Sir, if you don't mind me asking," starts Officer Shu, but Commander Yamada once again cuts him off. "As I stated before, officers, no captures this time." Back in the Capitol Palace, Zuko sat uncomfortably on his throne, awaiting the return of Commander Yamada. When he didn't hear back from Yamada or any of his other officers, he assumed the worst. Guards summoned Mei and Ty Lee to the throne room. A few moments later, Mei and Ty Lee were escorted into the royal throne room. Mei began to speak, but Zuko quickly cut her off with a wave of his hand. "The royal city is in shambles," said Zuko, "and my plan has ended in failure. I have a new task for you."